What I want to talk with you about is a little different angle, and I want to tell you how we negotiated, lost, and splossed using the service delivery agreement. For those on the webinar, this spreadsheet is on our website at www.sandersville.net under the Document Center. For anybody that's interested, would like to see it. When I came to work with the city of Sandersville, when I was asked to come there as an interim for 90 days, and that's been almost 6 years ago now, so I'm happy to say, the first thing I did is I wanted to find out a little bit about the city so I would know what I was committing to. And I went online to the Department of Audits, and I read the audits for 2 or 3 years. And then I did some research and tried to find out as much as I could about the city before I made that commitment. And I did, and I'm glad that I did. And then after I got there and I settled in a little bit, I called the county administrator and I asked him if he would come over and provide me with a copy of the service delivery agreement and the lost agreement and the splost agreement. And he asked me, he said, "Why do you want that service delivery thing? We don't use it anyway. I don't even know where it's at." And I said, I'm sure I have one here, but I just haven't been able to find it. And I said, I really wanted to make sure that what I had was what he had. So he said, "I'll see if I can find it and get it to you." And later that day, he brought it over to me, and he said, "Here is that thing that we don't use." And I said, "Well, thank you, I appreciate it." He didn't bring me the lost and the splost agreements, so I said, "Could you please share that with me also?" So he went back and he got it, and he came back, and we handed it to me. He said, "Now, you know that's county money. We decide how that gets divided and what it gets spent on." And I said, "Oh, is that how it used to be done here?" And a few months later, he retired, and they hired a new county administrator. And to my advantage, while I had a lot of experience in local government, he was new to local government. But I tried not to beat him up too bad when we did the lost and splost negotiations. We've become good friends, and we work very well together on a lot of projects, and our lost negotiations and splost went very smoothly. When we started it, the first meeting we had, I brought my budget, my audit, several other documents, my previous lost and previous splost agreements all to the table with me, and we spread it all out and we looked at it. And we went particularly by the 8 criteria that is in lost negotiations, and that is spelled out very clearly in the GMA publication, Lost Negotiations. We looked at that 8 criteria, and we looked at each service in the service delivery to see how it was being provided and who was funding it and how it was funded. And then we used this spreadsheet that Becky just passed out for you that we came up with, and I had used this previously, and it worked very well for us before. So this is the formula we came up with. The last lost that had been done in Washington County was completely on population served. This lost only 10% of the weight of the total amount, the total 100% was given to population. We did give that some consideration, and as I said, that was one of the 8 criteria is the population, your daytime population, but also your resident population. The other criteria that we looked very closely at, if you look at the second thing on this, it talks about, you see the population served, and then you see the commercial value. Well, one of the criteria is that you have to look at the point of sale, which generates the tax to be apportioned. We looked at the commercial and industrial tax digest, the tax base for the county and for all the cities, and what that was, and we used that as part of the formula that we used in considering that. And then in the column over from that, you see general fund expenditures. We looked at the general fund expenditures of the city and of the county. We looked at what services was being paid for out of the general fund and how they were being paid, what services were, where they were being provided at, and how that was working for everybody. So we used that a lot. One of the things we did when we looked at the expenditures, if you'll see down a little bit below the chart, you'll see some things highlighted in green. When we used the county's general fund budget, we did take out some things because they were not providing those services at all to the city. For example, roads. They did nothing with roads. We also considered that they get of the discretionary funds on the T-SPLOST, they get about $1.6 million a year in that, and they use that completely in the unincorporated area. None of that is used inside the city limits, while the city only gets about $168,000 a year. So that was taken out of that $10 million, and we subtracted that from their general fund expenditures. We also subtracted $250,000 that was for fire, rural fire, that was only in the rural area. It was not provided in the cities. It was an unincorporated area. So we took that number out, and then the number that was left is what we used for their general fund expenditures that we considered. The next thing that we did is we looked at the current loss of the share, and we gave that, the current share of the loss, and we gave that more weight than we did the other things combined. And the reason we did that is several of the cities, the smaller cities in particular, had obligations, and that is one of the criteria that you're supposed to consider is what are the current obligations that you have for the lost. And some of them were very dependent on that loss that they had, and we didn't want to damage those cities. It would not be to anybody's advantage for them to not be made whole in that. Another reason that you see two schedules here, the top and the bottom, if you use just this formula and you put everybody in one group, then a lot of the smaller cities would not get anything, and they would suffer greatly from using it this way. So what we did was we took Sandersville and Washington County and the city of Tennille, and we separated those cities out, and we used the same formula for those, and then we put the other 6 smaller cities into one group. And we looked at what the revenue was that each of the cities were getting prior to this negotiation. And we determined what we would need, what percentage of the total projections we would need to allocate to those cities so that they would be made whole. And then the rest of the revenues would go towards Tennille and Sandersville and Washington County. So that's why we split this up. And this formula worked very well for us. Everybody was pretty pleased with how it went. We went and met with all of the governing bodies and explained it to them all in great detail and worked with them on it. And so we were real pleased with how that worked out for us. We also used this formula basically for our SPLOST negotiations. We had to take some countywide level 1 projects off the top. They're building a jail for about $15 million that had to come off the top. But then everything after that, we used the same formula for, and that worked very well for us. So that's kind of how we negotiated and how it worked out. Some areas as we went through the process and we read our service delivery strategy, there were some areas that we felt like we needed to improve on and change, and we're still working towards getting that done. One of them is animal control. Animal control, the building, the facility now is owned and operated by the city. The county provides 50% funding, and the city of Tennille provides 15% funding, which is a pretty good funding source for the city. But the issue is we have a lot of calls out in the county. And when we go out in the county, our animal control officers have no law enforcement powers out in the county. So they have to call a deputy from the sheriff's department to go with them. And so it would work better if if it was a county-wide service and the county ran the animal control shelter, because then they wouldn't have to call somebody. They would be there. A lot of the cases that they get called to out in the county are really not animal control issues. We had 2 people, neighbors, that were fighting over a property line. It was a property line dispute, and it was about whose side of the property line the dog was sitting on. This one person tied the dog to a tree, and the dog kept wandering over onto the other person's property, and so that was really not an animal control issue. And so that's something we want to work towards, is we would like for the county to take over animal control. Another issue was economic development. In the past, the city and the county had paid for the Economic Development Authority. They had funded that equally. And the county, a couple of years ago, decided to levy a $0.25 millage rate, which we supported. We wanted that to happen. And when they did that, in their next budget year, the amount of funding they were provided prior to that, they took that out of their budget. So we followed suit and did the same thing. We said, you're levying that tax on all of the citizens, on all of the population, including what's inside the city. So if you're taking it off, we're taking it off. And they were not happy about that, and the Development Authority was not happy about that. But we agreed to do that anyway. The Chamber of Commerce is part of the Development Authority, so that was sort of separated out, and we did agree to do some funding equal to what the county was doing for the Chamber of Commerce to provide them some funding. But now the Development Authority is funded through that $0.25 on the property tax digest. So that worked out pretty well in the end, but it was a little treacherous during the process. Another thing that works well for us is EMA and 911 does not require a full-time director, but they need some help and they need a director. So our fire chief is the county's EMA and 911 director, and we work together on the funding on that, and that works really well for us. As I said, the county is building a new jail, and when we negotiated SPLOST and agreed to let them take that off, well, you have to allow them to take that off when it's a countywide level 1 project off the top of the SPLOST. It's actually going to take 3 SPLOST referendums to pay back the debt on that jail. So what we negotiated with them is during that time period, we don't pay any jail fees. We don't pay for them to house our prisoners during that time. And that was ending up being about $30 a day when we had prisoners out there. So that'll save the city some money in each of those years. And that worked well. Roads is another thing for us. The county does not provide any road services anywhere in the city, even though they get the discretionary funds, and they were paying for it out of their tax base. And you saw how we subtracted it from their general fund expenditure, so that was not included in the formula. So that decreased the amount that they would have gotten because we took that out. What they do is they have 4 commissioners, and they take their revenues for roads and divide them among the 4 commissioners, and 1/4 gets spent in each district. And our argument about roads is they have more roads, but they're not traveled like the city's roads are traveled. People come into the city to go to the hospital, to shop, to work. The most highly traveled roads are inside the city of Sandersville. And we really felt that that formula on the T-SPLOST particularly should have been more favored towards the city because of the use of the roads, not the miles of the roads. So we still have a little disagreement with that, but overall, the SPLOST negotiations went well for us. The loss negotiations went well. This formula worked well, and we were happy to go through that process. There's always going to be some things you'd like to see a little done a little differently, a little more. We would prefer they not build a jail because our percent would have been a lot more if they had our revenue that we would have gotten would have been a lot more. But we do see the need for the jail, so we did support that. And we have future projects that we plan to do that we feel like they'll commit to support us on. So that's pretty much how we use the criteria that is established in the service delivery agreement and applied it towards this formula to use, and how we reviewed all of our service delivery strategy and updated it as we went. And this was in 2012, and it's worked very well for us, and we'll probably use this formula again. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here.